September 12, 1944. In a smoke-filled Allied war room, typewriters hammered out orders. No smiles, no handshakes, no love. Soldiers were told to act like conquerors, never friends. But when they stepped into ruined German streets, the rules collapsed. Women traded bread for kindness. Children begged for chocolate. Laughter echoed where hate was expected. The paradox was shocking. Forbidden friendships turned into secret romances, and from those encounters came more than 90,000 children, born between American soldiers and German women. This wasn't propaganda, it was real life, messy, human, and unforgettable. And it rewrote history in ways no general ever planned. Stick with me to the very end to see how love and survival defied orders. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share to support this channel so we can keep uncovering the untold stories of World War II. September 12, 1944. Dwight D. Eisenhower SIP's Supreme Headquarters issued General Order No. 1, a blunt command that cut sharper than any bayonet. There will be no fraternization between Allied personnel and inhabitants of Germany. The words were bureaucratic, but their intent was absolute. To remind men who had stormed Normandy, crossed France, and stared at German machine gun nests that they were not liberators here. They were conquerors, and conquerors must not be tempted by the faces of the conquered. The logic was military and moral. Germany, after all, had waged the most destructive war in human history, leaving over 50 million dead. Now, Allied planners feared that kindness, even a smile, even a shared cigarette, would blur the line between victor and vanquished. The German people must feel they are a defeated nation, one US memorandum insisted. Fraternization would dilute this. The order went further. Soldiers were not to exchange gifts, take food, or converse with civilians. Children were not exempt. Even patting a blonde-haired boy on the head was officially forbidden. The clang of policy echoed louder than church bells. Conquerors must remain cold, untouchable, disciplined. But what did this sound like on the ground? In the words of Private First Class James O'Neill, marching through Aachen in October 1944, we were told, "Don't talk, don't smile, don't accept anything." But then a woman came out and gave us bread. It was warm. You could smell the yeast. What do? Pretend you're stone. Here lay the paradox. Commanders imagined armies as steel machines. But armies were made of flesh. Men who had crawled through mud and blood suddenly faced markets filled with children clutching potatoes, women carrying loaves baked with sawdust flour, and old men who bowed in silence. The human instinct was not hatred, but recognition. Yet the enforcement was real. Military police were instructed to patrol for violations. Fines could reach $65, nearly a month's pay for a private, and rumors spread of men demoted for nothing more than a shared laugh in a beer hall. By November 1944, reports from the front lines confirmed dozens of disciplinary actions. The clang of punishment became as common as the clang of empty ration tins. Still, the very existence of such an order betrayed unease. The Americans had seen liberation in France and Belgium, where locals showered them with flowers, wine, and embraces. Now they were ordered to wear masks of ice in towns that lay in rubble. The contrast could not have been sharper. The paradox deepened, a conqueror told to remain distant, a population desperate to reach across the divide. Eisenhower's order sought to keep history clean, but history is never clean. It is made of hunger, touch, fear, and longing. And so, even as ink dried on the prohibition, cracks appeared. Diaries began to note whispered conversations, small exchanges of cigarettes for eggs, bread for chocolate. Policy said one thing, but reality hummed another tune. The silence would not hold, and when the first American units marched into German towns, the policy collapsed in the face of faces. April 1945. American convoys rolled into bombed-out towns along the Rhine. The engines growled with the smell of diesel and hot oil, their shadows stretching over streets where houses gaped open like broken teeth. Allied commanders braced their men for bitterness, hostility, even sabotage. Yet what the soldiers encountered was something they had not rehearsed for: silence, then offerings. Sergeant William Lang recalled, "We came in with rifles ready, but the people didn't spit or shout. They handed us beer mugs. Old men tipped their hats. It was not hate, it was hunger." This was the contradiction that startled the occupiers. Germany had been painted as an implacable enemy, a land of fanatics bred on Hitler's sermons. But now, amid the rubble, soldiers saw not zealots but mothers cradling infants wrapped in curtains, children barefoot in the cold queues outside bakeries where there was no bread. By the spring of 1945, 1.6 million American troops were stationed in occupied Germany. They entered a world where official rations for civilians often fell to 1,275 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. In Hamburg, surveys found families boiling weeds and animal bones to make soup. In Cologne, children picked cigarette butts from gutters, tearing them apart for the shreds of tobacco inside. To the soldiers, the paradox was jarring. They had been warned of a dangerous people but were instead approached with handshakes, cautious smiles, and offerings of food. Even in the black markets that sprang up overnight, German civilians traded what little they had not for weapons or revenge but for butter, sugar, and coffee. Private Harold Klein described his first evening in a captured Bavarian village. The priest came out with beer, watery stuff, but still beer. He said nothing, just handed it to us. He said nothing, just handed it to us. Then the women came with bread that tasted of sawdust. They smiled, though their eyes looked 10 years older than their faces. We weren't supposed to take it, but who could refuse? Smell played its role in memory. The tang of yeast from makeshift bakeries, the acrid smoke of collapsed factories, the sweet-sour odor of cows slaughtered in desperation. For many GIs, these became the sense of paradox. The enemy as both villain and victim, both architect of war and beggar for food. Commanders knew the danger. If armies blurred the lines, discipline would waver. But reports from the ground revealed that distance was already crumbling. By late 1945, American military intelligence recorded widespread fraternization despite official prohibition. In Koblenz, MPs wrote of soldiers slipping into beer cellars at night, in Frankfurt of GIs giving chocolate to children who shadowed them through the streets. The irony grew sharper. The policy forbade any exchange. Yet every interaction reaffirmed the very humanity the order sought to suppress. What began as bread and beer became conversation, laughter, and music. In one Bavarian town, US troops joined villagers in singing folk songs under a roof with no walls, harmonies rising over ruins. It was in these first contacts that seeds of intimacy were planted. Hunger, curiosity, and sheer survival overpowered the ink of law. But this was only the beginning. The next paradox would prove even more powerful when food and cigarettes became the true currency of both survival and affection. By the summer of 1945, Germany's collapse was not only political and military but biological. Food production had plummeted by nearly half compared to pre-war levels. Official civilian rations often fell to as low as 1,275 calories per day, a starvation diet. Bread was stretched with sawdust flour. Potatoes were hoarded like treasure. Meat was nearly absent. Hunger was not an abstraction, but a constant ache gnawing at bellies, shaping every choice and every exchange. For American soldiers, the contrast was staggering. A US infantryman's daily ration package contained more calories than an entire German family might share in a day. Canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate bars, gum, cigarettes. As Sergeant Frank Caldwell wrote, "We had so much food we traded Spam like it was pocket change. Then you see a German kid's eyes when you give him a Hershey bar. You realize it's worth more than gold." And indeed, gold had ceased to matter. Cigarettes became the true currency of post-war Germany. A single American Lucky Strike could fetch a half loaf of bread. A carton could buy a bicycle. In Berlin, desperate families traded heirloom jewelry, silver candlesticks, even wedding rings for cartons of Camels. Hunger turned objects into barter, and soldiers carrying cigarettes suddenly wielded immense power. The paradox was clear. The conqueror's smallest luxuries, a stick of gum, a chocolate bar, a can of corned beef, became lifelines for the defeated. What had once been a soldier's comfort became a civilian's survival. This created connections that neither generals nor policies could control. Witness voices captured the uneasy intimacy of this economy. A young German woman, Lieselotte von Rantzau, recalled in a memoir, "If you smiled at a soldier, you could get a cigarette. With two, you could get bread. With bread, you could feed your mother for a day. What begins as gratitude quickly becomes dependency." It was not only barter. Relationships, too, emerged within this economy of hunger. Soldiers offered chocolate to children, and the mothers thanked them, sometimes with conversation, sometimes with companionship. In the words of one American GI, "You didn't plan it. You just wanted to help. And then you saw her eyes, and you forgot there was supposed to be a wall between us." Smell and taste defined this paradox. For German civilians, the scent of fried spam or the sweetness of American chocolate was overwhelming, reminders of abundance in an age of famine. For soldiers, the taste of watery German beer or ersatz bread was equally unforgettable, a sensory lesson in the depth of deprivation. Each exchange reinforced a shared truth. One side had more than it could consume, the other had less than it could endure. By late 1945, reports estimated that 60% of fraternization incidents began with food or cigarettes. In occupied Bavaria, U.S. authorities recorded an average of 30 new liaisons per week involving American soldiers and German women. These were not merely fleeting encounters but relationships forged in hunger and sustained by barter. But such intimacy carried consequences beyond policy violations. The pregnancies that followed would soon confront military leaders with a new crisis they could not ration away. The paradox of bread and cigarettes was only a prelude. What came next, the clash between rules and reality, would tear down the last defenses of the non-fraternization order. On paper, the lines were clear. Non-fraternization was law, stamped on September 12, 1944, reinforced in every briefing, every field manual, every military police order sheet. The punishment was meant to sting, a $65 fine, nearly a private's entire monthly pay, or worse, loss of stripes. Commanders declared fraternization a danger to discipline and the mission. But on the streets of Frankfurt, Munich, or Nuremberg, the law was paper against fire. By mid-1945, military police reports flooded headquarters with contradictions. In Cologne, MPs noted that GIs were seen openly escorting German women through the rubble, offering cigarettes in exchange for companionship. In Stuttgart, one report estimated 80% of enlisted men had at some point broken the rule. Enforcement became a game of shadows. MPs patrolling beer halls, soldiers slipping out back doors, everyone knowing the law was more farce than fact. The paradox sharpened with every passing week. Official orders demanded coldness. Reality demanded warmth. Soldiers longed for human contact after years of killing and marching. Civilians longed for food, protection, and recognition. The wall that policy built was fragile, and each smile, each shared cigarette, each whispered conversation chipped away at it. Some officers saw the futility. By October 1945, General Eisenhower himself admitted privately that strict enforcement is impossible. In November, the U.S. Army quietly relaxed restrictions, permitting soldiers to converse with adults in public. Though intimacy and marriage remained banned, it was a crack in the dam, and once water flows, walls do not hold. Private diaries show how quickly the change spread. Corporal Stanley Horvath wrote, "First it was talking, then it was walking with them. Then the rules became a joke. By Christmas we were dancing in their halls." Numbers reveal the collapse in sharper relief. A December 1945 military intelligence survey estimated that in some urban areas, as many as 1 in 4 American soldiers was involved in a relationship with a German woman. In Berlin, coffee and dance evenings, semi-legal gatherings sponsored by welfare officers, often saw entire units fraternizing in full view of their commanders. The sensory world of these encounters tells its own truth, the creak of dance hall floorboards under boots and heels, The faint sweetness of American cocoa mingling with the sour bite of German beer. The warmth of hands held in defiance of orders that by then almost everyone knew could not be enforced. Still, cracks carried consequences. Military courts continued to prosecute soldiers, at least symbolically. In one case, Private Raymond H., caught sharing a bed with a German woman, was fined and confined for 30 days. The official record noted, "conduct prejudicial to discipline," yet by the time he returned to duty, the very same unit was hosting social evenings with German civilians under the Red Cross banner. The paradox had reached its breaking point. Rules existed, but reality triumphed. Soldiers were no longer conquerors behind glass. They were men in a ruined land, entwined with its women, enmeshed in its survival. And with intimacy came consequence. By early 1946, military hospitals reported a rise in pregnancies among German women, and the US Army faced a question it could not find, confine, or ignore: what to do with the children of occupation. The order had collapsed. The next battle would be waged not on paper but in maternity wards. By the spring of 1946, whispers of romance and barter had become something more tangible: the cries of newborns. German hospitals, already stripped bare of supplies, now faced an unexpected surge. Babies were being delivered with American blood in their veins. The US Army had anticipated disobedience, but not the scale. Officially, military records logged around 37,000 occupation births by American fathers in the first years. Later surveys pushed the number far higher, roughly 68,000 documented, and some research estimates approaching 90,000 by the end of the decade. In Munich alone, one maternity ward reported that nearly 1 in 7 infants was fathered by a foreign soldier. The paradox was cruel. Soldiers had been ordered to keep distance, yet their presence filled cribs across Germany. Commanders who once feared fraternization as a danger to morale now faced the logistical nightmare of children they were unprepared to claim. The US Army's official stance was blunt: no responsibility. A Stars and Stripes article in 1946 reminded readers that American soldiers cannot be compelled to support illegitimate children abroad. German women bore the burden alone. In bombed-out cities where rations barely covered survival, single mothers carried infants swaddled in army blankets, often marked by their darker hair or foreign features. The voices of those women reveal the strain. One young mother, recorded by a Berlin welfare worker, said, "They told me he was married in America. I do not even have shoes for the baby. But when I look at his face, I see him again." Another woman from Frankfurt recalled how neighbors whispered kind, GI child, as both stigma and label. The statistics grew heavier. In the American zone of occupation alone, welfare offices by 1947 tracked more than 36,000 cases of paternity claims, yet fewer than 10% received any financial support. Court cases were nearly impossible. US military law did not oblige soldiers to pay. German social workers called it a catastrophe without precedent. The sensory world of these children was shaped by scarcity. They were wrapped in repurposed uniforms, fed from bottles improvised from tin cans, rocked to sleep in houses where walls were patched with cardboard. Their cries echoed against ruins still blackened by bomb fire. To their mothers they were both love and burden, symbols of intimacy but also of abandonment. And yet, amid hardship, there was resilience. Diaries show women organizing barter networks for infant clothes, soldiers quietly sending money in unmarked envelopes, and some fathers even risking punishment to acknowledge their children. One corporal stationed in Kassel confessed in a letter, "They tell me to forget, but how do you forget your own son's eyes?" The paradox widened into a legal crisis. The US banned marriages with German women until December 1946, fearing political backlash at home. Love was not only discouraged but outlawed. Couples caught seeking marriage licenses faced rejection and, in some cases, disciplinary action. But bans could not erase reality. By 1947, the US Congress began to face pressure from soldiers and their families. The War Brides Act eventually allowed around 15,000 German women to emigrate to America with their GI husbands, a small number compared to the tens of thousands left behind. but proof that policy could not forever defy human bonds. These children and their mothers stood at the intersection of two worlds, law and love, scarcity and abundance, rejection and recognition. They embodied the contradiction of occupation itself. But the paradox carried another layer, one that exposed even deeper fractures in American society, the story of race, and how African American soldiers and their children bore a double burden of stigma. Among the thousands of children born in occupied Germany, one group faced an especially cruel fate, those fathered by African American GIs. Roughly 5,000 such children were born between 1945 and 1955, their very existence colliding with the fault lines of both German and American prejudice. The paradox was bitter. These soldiers had fought to liberate Europe from fascism, yet at home in the United States, they lived under Jim Crow, barred from restaurants, schools, and even voting booths. In Germany, they carried the full weight of American segregation into the rubble of the Reich. Military policy not only discouraged but actively obstructed relationships between black soldiers and German women. Marriage requests from African American troops were denied at rates far higher than those of their white comrades. The official explanation was discipline. The real reason was race. For the women who bore their children, the stigma was twofold. German society, still steeped in Nazi racial ideology, branded them Negerhuren, Negro whores. Their children were called Mischlingskinder, mixed-blood children, ostracized in schools, sometimes denied baptism by conservative pastors, and often tracked by welfare authorities as problems. A welfare report from Württemberg bluntly recorded, "These children will never be fully accepted." And yet, paradoxically, many of these children were cherished by their mothers with defiance. One woman from Mannheim told a US social worker, "They call him names, but when I look at him I see hope. He will grow strong like his father." Her words captured the fierce loyalty that survived amid condemnation. The American Army, meanwhile, enforced its own segregation within occupation units. In many towns, black and white soldiers were housed separately, fed in different mess halls, even patrolled different sectors. And when African American soldiers fathered children, the army often intervened not with support but with silence. Very few were granted permission to marry. The War Brides Act of 1946 technically opened the door, but bureaucratic roadblocks meant only a small fraction succeeded. The statistics underline the injustice. While approximately 15,000 German women emigrated to the US as war brides, fewer than 500 were wives of black soldiers. Countless petitions were denied with language citing social incompatibility. The sensory details of this paradox were cruelly vivid. Schoolyards rang with taunts. Children with darker skin were spat on in trams or shoved in food lines. Yet those same children often became objects of fascination, strangers stopping to touch their hair, to remark on their difference. For them, identity was never private. It was displayed in every glance. But here, too, resilience bloomed. African American GIs often built informal support networks, pooling rations for their partners, slipping money to mothers despite regulations. Some fought for years to bring their families to the US, navigating a bureaucracy designed to resist them. Diaries record their frustration. "I fought Nazis, but my own country won't let me marry the woman I love." The paradox of race within occupation illuminated an uncomfortable truth. America had defeated a regime built on racial hierarchy, only to enforce its own in victory. The children born of these unions carried that contradiction in their very bodies, reminders that war's legacies were not only rubble and treaties but flesh and blood. This double burden of hunger, of stigma, of official rejection would echo for decades, shaping identity and memory long after the occupation ended. But beyond race and romance lay another layer: bureaucracy. Love might defy rules, but paperwork would decide who stayed together, who was torn apart, and who spent a lifetime searching for answers. If hunger and desire drew men and women together, bureaucracy often stood ready to pull them apart. For every moment of intimacy in the shadows, there followed an avalanche of paperwork. Soldiers who sought to marry German women entered a labyrinth of forms, interviews, investigations, and delays that could stretch for years. The War Brides Act of 1945 was supposed to simplify matters, but in occupied Germany it collided with suspicion. The US Army feared infiltration by enemy agents, moral decay among troops, and the political optics of fraternization. Each marriage request required approval from multiple levels of command, a background check on the bride, and often testimony from neighbors or local officials, the very people who might despise her for consorting with the enemy. Letters between soldiers and their sweethearts reveal the toll. A GI from Ohio wrote in late 1946, "I filled out the forms again, honey. They said another 3 months. Don't lose hope. Keep writing me." His fiancée, a German woman in Stuttgart, responded, "They treat me like a criminal because I love you. Every knock at the door I think it is the police, not the postman." These were not isolated cases. Statistics show that by 1948, more than 20,000 American soldiers had applied to marry German women, yet fewer than half were approved. Many couples waited 2, 3, even 4 years before permission arrived, if it came at all. Some children were born and grew into toddlers while their parents' applications gathered dust in filing cabinets. The bureaucracy was not faceless. It carried the tone of moral judgment. Denials often cited vague reasons: unsuitable character, political unreliability, unfit for American society. In practice, this meant anything from her past Nazi Party membership to rumors of prostitution, or simply the prejudice of an officer who disliked the idea of marrying the enemy. Yet couples persisted. Diaries speak of desperate ingenuity, soldiers bribing clerks with cigarettes to move papers forward, women forging witness statements, chaplains marrying couples in secret before orders could stop them. In some cases, sympathetic officers quietly approved marriages despite regulations, understanding that love and law were often irreconcilable. The sensory world of bureaucracy was its own torture. Endless lines outside military offices, the stale smell of ink and carbon paper, the clatter of typewriters punching out verdicts that would shape entire lives. For lovers who had endured bombings, hunger, and separation, the true battlefield became a desk stacked with forms. And yet, paradoxically, this wall of paperwork made their commitments fiercer. Couples who endured years of waiting, letters delayed or censored, and the constant threat of denial often emerged with bonds tempered like steel. As one soldier wrote after finally receiving approval in 1949, "If they tried so hard to stop us and failed, then nothing in life can stop us now." By the early 1950s, tens of thousands of German women had crossed the Atlantic as war brides, settling into new lives in America. But many others were left behind, denied, abandoned, or forgotten. For every reunion at a US dockside, there was another woman staring at an empty mailbox in Munich or Bremen, wondering if her letters had been lost or her lover had simply stopped writing. The paradox of paperwork was simple yet devastating. A war fought with tanks and planes could end in months, but love fought against typewriters and stamps could take years, or never succeed at all. Beyond the marriages and denials, however, lay an even more invisible legacy. For many of the children born in these years, the bureaucracy determined not only their family's fate, but their very sense of identity. Who was their father? Where had he gone? Did he even know they existed? These questions would ripple through decades, shaping memories long after the occupation forces went home. By the mid-1950s, the visible presence of American uniforms in Germany began to fade. Tanks rolled back into bases, occupation zones shifted into alliances, and the language of conquerors gave way to that of Cold War partners. But the children remained. Estimates vary. Official counts spoke of 68,000 occupation children fathered by American soldiers, while later research pushed the number closer to 90,000. Some scholars suggest the true total, including unregistered births, may have been higher still. Each number carried a face. A boy in Bremen with his father's blue eyes but no address to write to. A girl in Frankfurt teased as unkind, her mother shamed in the marketplace. And decades later, middle-aged men and women searching DNA databases or archives, still asking the simplest of questions: who was my father? The legacy of these unions was layered with paradox. They were born from war but carried the potential for peace. They came out of hunger yet embodied abundance. For many Germans, the children represented both defeat and survival, both humiliation and hope. As one post-war teacher recalled, they looked different, yes, but they laughed in German. They played in German. They were ours, and we had to face what that meant. The racial divide left its deepest scars. Roughly 5,000 children were fathered by African American soldiers, and they bore not only the weight of illegitimacy, but the weight of prejudice. In a society still recovering from the toxic legacy of Nazi racial ideology, these children were often shunned twice over for being occupation children and for the color of their skin. Many were placed in orphanages or foster care, their mothers pressured into giving them up. Yet decades later, many of these same individuals would become central voices in memory projects, forcing both America and Germany to confront truths long buried. Organizations like the Occupation Children Research Project have since documented the interwoven stories of these families. Their work estimates that tens of thousands of descendants across Germany, the United States, and beyond carry this legacy, not only in bloodlines but in culture, memory, and identity. Reunion stories abound, a daughter meeting her father at age 50, a son learning he had siblings in Kansas he never knew existed. Each reunion is a living rebuke to the silence once imposed by bureaucracy and shame. And yet, silence remains a key part of the moral reckoning. For decades after the war, most Germans rarely spoke of these children. Many soldiers never told their families back home. Mothers often carried their stories to the grave. The paradox is haunting. What was once forbidden, condemned, or hidden now stands as one of the most enduring human legacies of the occupation. The broader historical lesson stretches far beyond family trees, policies that sought to engineer behavior. No fraternization, no marriages, no children, collapsed against the reality of human need. Military orders dictated distance, but life created intimacy. What leaders saw as weakness, individuals experienced as survival. The American plan to keep soldiers aloof ended with tens of thousands of German women raising children who would grow up under two shadows, that of the swastika and that of the stars and stripes. In the end, the occupation years reveal a paradox at the heart of history. The Americans had come as conquerors. They left as teachers, fathers, and sometimes as ghosts. Their greatest weapon was not the Sherman tank or the B-29 bomber, but something more ordinary: cigarettes, chocolate, and the willingness to talk when orders said silence.